Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lesson 1 of Semester 2 in Psychology at Odyssey Charter School. This is Mr. Carter, your teacher, and for those of you that are returning psychology students, that means you had Semester 1, you're going to see everything is pretty much the same in terms of the process that we use in class. We're just going to be doing new material, so you'll be set to go. Just start cranking away like you have Semester 1. If you are new to the class for Semester 2, I would ask that before you go too much further, feel free to watch this video, but before you go too much further, please make sure that you go and under the course materials, you click on New Students. There's a link for you that will walk you through exactly how we do things in this class and what the progress is of the lesson. So please take a look at that. I think that'll help answer a lot of questions. Of course, as always, if any of you, new or old students, have any questions, please direct them to me and we'll take care of them. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started on Lesson 1 for Semester 2, which is about memory and thought. So in this lesson, we're going to kind of look and see how the brain processes information, stores it, and allows you to recall it when you need it. And that's obviously a huge piece of being a human being. Without a good memory, you are at a distinct disadvantage, so we'll talk a little bit about how you can prove it as well. Before we begin, we're going to talk, as we always do a little spotlight about something going on specifically related to this lesson. And this time we're going to talk about something called the photographic memory. Most of you have heard of something called the photographic memory. The idea that you see something, or a person with photographic memory sees something and can instantaneously remember all information about it. Photographic memory is kind of a term that we use out in the world, but a psychologist would use something which is more accurately known as eidetic memory. And the reason is that it's really this eidetic memory is the idea that you can recall very specific details from all the senses. So it's not just visual like photographic memory would imply, but it is all the senses. You can remember smells incredibly acutely. You can remember touch, all those things. All your senses are heightened, and more so than that, your ability to store that information in your brain is almost perfect with the experience. Most people do not have this issue. Obviously, this is very rare, and it's actually hard for psychologists to distinguish between somebody who has a good memory or who has learned good devices to remember things, good memory skills and strategies, from somebody who truly has an eidetic memory. In fact, a lot of psychologists are not sure that this is even real. It's just people have, a heightened recall for information as opposed to the ability to remember everything very acutely. But it is interesting. It's a fascinating thing. Over on the right-hand side, there is a little graph there, or a picture. Those are the first 1,000 digits of pi, the mathematical construct pi 3.14 that you use a lot when you're figuring out diameters and radiuses and areas and circumferences of circles and things like that. Well, the world record for somebody who can remember the digits of pi is over the 30,000th digit. Remember, pi goes on forever. It's a unending number. And there is a person who has actually been able to memorize and then repeat back 31,000 digits in order completely accurately before he made a mistake. So there's something special going on in that guy's memory that's beyond my ability, that's for sure. Whether or not it's eidetic or not, who knows? But it's kind of interesting to kind of look at this. Okay, so getting into memory, let's define some terms. We always do this. We take a look at some of the critical terms and what we're going to be talking about. Memory itself is simply the storage and retrieval of what's been learned or experienced. And the analogy that people oftentimes use is with the computer. We think about that we store information in the computer on the hard drive, and it just sits in there, and it just kind of kicks back, and then when we need it, we pull it up, and we can act upon it. And it's kind of similar. Obviously, there's a mechanical versus a biological difference here, but it's not a bad analogy to think about, is that the memory is essentially what we have burned onto our individual hard drives that allow us to function and recall that information when we want. There are several memory processes, 3 main memory processes that we want to talk about. The first is encoding. And encoding is the process that occurs when the senses and the brain transforms the information that's brought in by our senses so we can process it. So we see something, we touch something, we hear something, we taste something. Instantaneously, our brain is trying to translate and transform that into a memory that can be stored. The storage piece is the next part, is how do we maintain, how do we categorize, how do we organize that information so that we can hold on to it, maintain it, and eventually do the third step, which is retrieve it. And that is, what do we do when we need to pull that information out of our library of stuff on the dusty shelves of our mind and bring that forward so we can act upon it. So those three things. Encoding is the first step, then we got to store it, and then we've got to ultimately, when we want to use it, retrieve that information. So those are the main stages of memory. So those were the three memory processes. In terms of the stages of memory themselves, we go from sensory. Sensory memory is essentially just kind of a very, very quick holding place for information. So data comes in through our senses, and we hold on to it for literally a fraction of a second. It hasn't gone into it hasn't been processed, we haven't done anything with it. And in that fraction of a second, the brain is deciding what it wants to do with that input. Is this information that I can just kind of get rid of? Is this information that I need to store and do something with? What's happening here? So it's just very quick, and things are coming in and out of our mind all the time. Our brain is deciding whether or not to act upon it. The functions of the sensory memory part, again, this is all happening in a fraction of a second, is it prevents the brain from being overwhelmed with input. If we had to memorize and categorize and organize every bit of information that we bring in over the course of the day, our brains would be mush. We'd be overwhelmed. So it's a process where we can say, this is important, I'm going to do something with it. This is unimportant, I'm going to forget it instantaneously. And this is happening, we don't even think about it. It's just happening as a part of the process of our mind. The second thing that's important, or the function of this sensory memory, is that it allows for us to have some decision time in terms of how to handle it. So again, our brain is making a split-second decision on important, not important, and dealing with it that way. And it also allows for something called continuity and stability. We are continually getting that information in, and because it's being held for a split second, it allows us to ease into the next thing that's happening. So it allows for continuity and stability. Our brains are not being continually overwhelmed by information. So the first stage of memory is sensory. Again, this is happening within, like a 10th or a 20th of a second, and it's really happening without our conscious mind dealing with it. Then we go into the next stage, which is truly, memory as we would think about it, and that's our short-term memory. And this is any information that's in our head that we're acting upon at any given time is sitting in our short-term memory. Memory can go back and forth between all three stages. It can go from the sensory to the short-term to what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the long-term memory, and then back from the long-term to the short-term, so we can act upon it. Short-term is really where we're dealing with some information, some memory at that point. We have to act upon it. Information that we pull in through the brain has to be acted upon in order for it to go to short-term memory. If it's just a fleeting thing across, then it will be dropped by our sensory information, our sensory memory that we just talked about, and we won't memorize it. If it's important enough to go into our short-term, we have to do something with it. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. We can rehearse it. We can repeat data over and over and over again. One of the classic tricks, if you're learning somebody's name, is hey, I'm Bob, how are you doing? And then so you got to say Bob, Bob, Bob over and over in your mind until that stuff sits in your memory. Okay, I remember that guy's name. His name is Bob. If you don't do that, out it goes, and you don't remember it. Okay, so that's one way. That's rehearsal. Chunking is another way, and that's connecting larger bits of information together as one. So rather than memorizing 7 distinct digits to remember your phone number, we think of it, usually how we do it, is in 2 pieces. We break up 7 digits into 3 and then 4. And that dash that's put there was actually done because of this very fact when we went to the phone numbers, because we were having a hard time memorizing just 7 distinct information. We said, let's chunk this up, 3 and then 4. It's a lot easier to remember it. And then something called primary recency. And that is that we tend to remember the first and last bits of information in a series of data. So if you're given a list, or you're given a a bunch of definitions, chances are you'll memorize the first couple of things that you look at and the last couple of things. And the stuff in the middle is where you're going to have trouble, okay? So if you're memorizing the states and capitals all in one chunk, Alaska and Alabama, you're probably going to have down. You probably get Wyoming and Washington down as well. And somewhere right in the middle, Michigan, you may not be able to remember very well, okay, because it's in the middle of a set of data. So that's the short-term memory. The third stage of memory is long-term. And long-term is really where it's sitting in there. It's something that's so important that we have to keep it for a long time, or it's been over and over, drilled in us, so we just memorized it, whether we wanted to or not. It's sitting in our long-term memory, and it's able to be recalled and retrieved when we need to use it. So this is the long period of time. There's a couple of different types of long-term memory. There's what's called semantic memory. That's our knowledge of language. You don't have to, continually rememorize and rehearse your use of language. It's something that we use so much and it's so ingrained in us. This has become in our long-term memory. So you're not going to tomorrow forget English. It's just not going to happen. Getting a new language does have to go through that process, and especially when you're not immersed in it. So that's why people say, if you really want to learn Spanish, or you really want to learn German, or you really want to learn French, you've got to go to that country and be immersed in it, because then it will go into your long-term memory. We also have what's called episodic memory, and that's memory of our own life. So information about you and how you grew up and what the house looked like and how it smelled and how your brother talked and all that kind of stuff, that has become ingrained in because it's part of our world. That's episodic memory, and that's unique to you. Nobody else has those exact same memories besides you. And then we have procedural memory, and those are basic skills. We remember how to walk. We remember how to do basic functionary skills because we have used them over and over again. We don't have to think about, okay, what do I do to walk again? One step in front of the other. If you have a traumatic brain injury, however, and that long-term storage is damaged, you have to relearn those. And so that's what a lot of people that have gotten into a horrible car wreck or soldiers who have gotten wounded have to relearn some of these procedural skills because they have to go back into that long-term memory. So that's where it sits there. The most important thing about long-term memory is you've got to be able to retrieve it. So we got to be able to pull it out and bring it to short-term memory so that we can work with it. And that's the process of retrieval that we'll look at in just a second. So memory retrieval is finding what you need when you need it. So if I, am faced with an issue where I have some information and I want to be able to use it, I've got to be able to pull that off the stacks, or pull, if you think about the library, or pull that off the hard drive, if you want to think about the computer, and bring it down to something that I can use, okay? And there's several different ways that can be done. One is called recognition, and that's identification of something that you may not have experienced exactly, but have some general understanding of. And the example they use in the book, which is a pretty good one, is that I may not have heard every piano concerto that's ever been written, but when I hear a piano being played, I can identify that as a piano. So the music I may not know, but I can identify that a piano is playing. So I have a relationship with something, even though I don't know exactly what's happened. Recall is another part of memory retrieval, and that's where you're truly pulling up information that's been previously learned. Information that this is something that happened to me, something that I did, something that I saw, something that I tasted in the past, and I'm pulling it back up and I'm going to use it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that sometimes there's holes in that data. Sometimes there's gaps in the information that we're recalling from long-term memory, and what we tend to do as human beings, and some do it more than others, is we do what's called confabulation. And that is that we kind of add in the pieces to kind of connect these memories together. Some people call it embellishing a memory. And so, a good example is if you've been watching sports, Manti Te'o, this linebacker from Notre Dame, had this kind of made-up experience with him and his girlfriend, and he started filling in gaps when they didn't work real well for him. Well, we do that in memory too, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people feel like eyewitness testimony, which we'll look at in your case study, is not particularly accurate, because if we didn't have something to tell the police officer, we add stuff in. There's a picture over here on the right-hand side of the most recent Total Recall movie, and that's what we're talking about, recall. That's, the concept in the movie is that memories are implanted, and if they're implanted and brought forth in someone's mind, they're just as real as if those actually happened to you. So, by the way, I think the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie was better than the second one, but that's just my personal opinion. So that's a little bit about memory retrieval. Forgetting. We've all experienced forgetting. Some are more forgetful than others. I am finding that as I get older, it is getting just absolutely gross how much I'm forgetting and how much I'm always, having stuff on the kind of the tip of my tongue. And boy, I know that person, but I can't remember the name. I'm certainly working towards having a hard time pulling up information. It's a sad, sad story. Hopefully you, with your young mind, is working better than me, but we've all experienced forgetting. And essentially what happens in forgetting, if you want to think about it from a psychological standpoint, is three things. Either the information is decaying, it's being interfered with, or it's being repressed. So let's go through those three. Decaying is that just things fade over time. Something that I did when I was 3 that was an important memory that I could probably recall when I was 7. Now that I'm a little bit older, I can't recall it anymore. It's just decayed. Over time, I've kind of lost that memory. The stronger the memory and the more it's acted upon, the longer it will take to decay. Interference. Sometimes memories are blocked or erased by new data. And so here's kind of a good way to go back to the analogy of the computer. If you overwrite a file with another file, you've lost the first file. A good example would be if I'm really good at memorizing my current address. I could tell it to you in 2 seconds. My address 5 houses ago, it's going to take me a minute to try to find that because it's been overwritten. In my memory banks, I think of address as my current home. I don't think of it as 5 homes ago. So that's where something's been interfered with. Repression is a third type, and repression is something where the memory has been made inaccessible because it's so disturbing. And this is truly something that's happened generally in people that have had pretty disturbing emotional or physical trauma. So people that have been abused, women that have been raped, oftentimes will have memory repression, where they just essentially don't even have that memory available to them unless they go through some very, very strong counseling to deal with it, because bringing it forward can be so emotionally damaging. Another way of forgetting, which is more of a physical way, is what's called amnesia. And amnesia is usually where there's been some sort of a physical trauma that leads to memory loss. So maybe a traumatic brain injury, maybe something happened where somebody was horribly sick and there was a high fever. So there's been damage to the brain, and those memories have been lost. And this can happen to people where chunks of their lives disappear because of some sort of physical trauma. So now that we know a little bit about memory, how do we improve our memory? And certainly you as a student, it makes a lot of sense for you to improve your memory because that's going to help with your studies. So let's kind of look at it from that perspective. Here's some different things that can be done, and they go into a little bit more detail in the book about this to improve your memory. Rehearsal, especially what's called elaborate rehearsal, and that's relating new information to stuff you already know. So if you can memorize something by connecting it with something you know, you tend to do better. So that would be something like if you can sing a song, a tune you like, and if you can make something that you're trying to memorize into that song, there's some connections there. That's elaborate rehearsal, and your brain will work with that information better than if you're just trying to memorize something cold. Studying very different subjects back to back. This is kind of interesting. If you study your history and your psychology next to each other, you have less of a chance of remembering those because they're similar subjects than if you study your history and your math. They're pulling different parts of the brain, they're being categorized in different spaces, and the confusion is less. So that might be something for you to try when you're studying, is do a little history, then do a little math, then maybe do a little English, then do a little science. If you break it up into non-similar subjects, the chances of you memorizing those are better. And here's a big one, especially for Odyssey students: studying small amounts over longer periods of time, you tend to do better. So when we cram everything in at the last second, and this is not only for our school, but if you're studying for the SAT, or you're studying for your proficiencies, or in college when you're studying for your final exams, chances are you're going to do poorly related to if you had studied small bits of information over long periods of time. And then something called mnemonic devices. And we all know what a mnemonic device is, even if we couldn't pull up that term. This is a technique of making associations to memorize things. And the classic mnemonic device is on this t-shirt here. You can actually buy a t-shirt because it's so classic, which is how to remember the order of operations. And we all know this one. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Now, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Those words mean nothing when you're thinking about the order of operations. But the first letter of each of those tells you what order to do things in. So if you can memorize, rather than saying parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, subtract, rather than trying to memorize those things in order, if you can remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, and focus on the first letter of each word, boom, you've got it down. So that's a classic one. Never eat soggy wheat or soggy waffles, I guess, is the word. If you're trying to do north, south, east, and west. That's another mnemonic device. So all these things are ways that we can memorize information more effectively. All right, so that's lesson 1 of semester 2. It's great to have you along for this particular bit of information. What we'll be doing from here on out is just continuing to move through with our lessons. If you would go ahead now and continue the reading activity, and then ultimately your case study and your assignment, then you'll be done with lesson 1. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon.